A second story. About 7 years ago, I was walking in the concourse of Young and Bloor near the subway, and walking toward me was Knowlton Nash, and we all remember Knowlton Nash from the CBC National, et cetera. So I stop him and say, "Hi, Knowlton, will you come and guest lecture in my class?" Now, if I see any of you on the street, watch out, because I'll do the same thing to you. And Knowlton said, "Sure, I'll come." And so in preparation, I took his book out of the library. It's a great book. It's called Trivia Pursuit, and I love the subtitle, How Showbiz Values Are Corrupting the News. And in the book and in his conversations with my students, Knowlton talked about the sea change in the media that he's experienced after joining the CBC in 1952. He said, "When I joined the CBC then, all the major news networks in the United States were independently owned. Now they're all owned by larger conglomerates." And as he details, Fox News, of course, is owned by Rupert Murdoch. NBC is now owned by General Electric. CBS is owned by Westinghouse, and ABC is owned by Disney. So Knowlton told a story about how this affects the news. After the first foray of US troops in Afghanistan, ABC News wanted to send a news crew. That was not deemed acceptable by the US military unless the crew were embedded journalists. But the ABC leadership, which is owned by Disney, had a better idea. Why don't we do a docudrama of what the life of a grunt is? You know, how hard it is there in the tough terrain? And that was acceptable. So that's what they did. And what Knowlton Nash was saying is that, are all the people bad people in Disney? No, but they come from an entertainment worldview, not a journalism worldview. And he said there's a huge difference. They don't have the kind of dedication to the democratic institution of journalism. And this is a crisis for our democracy. And he was quite adamant on this. And it's a helpful book to read. And he also begins to explore the kind of infotainmentization of our media, the trivialization, the move towards celebrity gossip as opposed to hard journalism. And he does analyses of the percentage of serious news stories done in 1960 compared to gossip column stories, and then shows how that has really changed in 1990. By that point, many more stories, a larger percentage are now being done on celebrity news and gossip, etc. And it's a very frightening thing for him. He also reflected on his time in Vietnam, where he reported on the Vietnam War. And he said, this notion of embedded journalists is a complete evisceration of the democratic role of the journalist. And he said, I was able to go freely with American troops. At one point, I was with a US platoon that was on patrol. We were attacked, 6 American troops were killed, and we went back to Saigon for the 5 o'clock follies. That's what the American journalists called the official Pentagon briefing, because they knew they'd be lied to. And at the 5 o'clock follies, an official from the Pentagon said, there were no casualties today. Now, because Knowlton was there, he could report this. But he said, when you're embedded, this is not something you can report. And so the role of the media in terms of democracy and the role of an independent media apart from corporate ownership is central here. And it helps filter into what is happening now with climate change and the media. A third story that I just wanted to share with you is the story of Archbishop Romero. Many of you know Archbishop Romero, and just recently, the 30th anniversary of his assassination was marked. This is a challenge for us in religious communities, because Archbishop Romero, when all the media in San Salvador was shutting down the huge human rights abuses and the number of people who were showing up daily being murdered by death squads, used the radio station for his 2-hour homilies, and these would be broadcast across the country. Sunday after Sunday, it was a human rights analysis of what was happening, who was being killed, where they were being killed, and how outrageous this was. The Catholic news station was bombed repeatedly. Of course, he became awash in death threats and ultimately was killed saying Mass. But the Catholic press was the only press at that time reporting on what had to be reported. And so it's a challenge for all of us who are in religious circles with our own media to kind of make a dedication to the truth within our particular framework. There's some excellent things, as you know, about climate change and the covering up of information. I don't have time to describe all of that here, but I will be writing some of the resources here. It's both an attack on science, and Derek knows well about this. It's also an attack on the media that tries to report on science. And in some cases, it's the same people that were involved in the anti-smoking campaign to create doubt. And this is detailed in Heat by George Monbiot in his chapter, The Denial Industry. So if you ever need to find the data, just go to that chapter. He's got a lot on this. Also, there's a book, Crimes Against Nature by Robert Kennedy Jr., where he outlines the attack on people like Dr. James Hansen and others in the US scientific community who were basically forced to recant their information, or it was edited. This is an interesting book, Censoring Science by Mark Bowen, Inside the Political Attack on Dr. James Hansen and the Truth of Global Warming. So basically, what I think that we might want to think about here is the political economy of the stories. We can say, oh, Canadians and Americans just love the automobile. That's why they're so dedicated to them. Well, that eviscerates the larger political economy of a story that you know well about Standard Oil, Firestone, and General Motors buying up the major streetcar networks of the United States in the 20s and 30s, ripping them out to sell buses. This isn't just America's love of the automobile. That choice was taken away from them. And I used to teach at the University of Notre Dame, and I take my students down to the Studebaker factory. It's all brownfields now, but they have one little corner which is a museum. And you see the top of the line cars from 1903 in Studebaker, all electric. In 1905, there were 300 electric service stations in Boston. There were 3 gas stations. And to say that the technology around the battery of an electric car has not improved since 1905, when we can now call people on the moon when they're traveling there, I don't believe it. I don't know about you. But this is the larger story behind our stories. And so as we begin to look at this, we, I think, are compelled to look at the political and economic history of our narratives, as well as the social, religious, and cultural lineaments of the stories. And I'll just leave you with the power of language with an attempt at humor. René Descartes, we all are indebted to René Descartes. Well, he was having a glass of wine and a little bit to eat. And he was talking to the garçon and said, could I have another wine? He said, sure. It gets served. And then the waiter comes back and says, can I get you another glass of wine, Professor Descartes? And he says, I think not. And poof, he just disappeared. He was just gone. Just like me.